Well, hello, Mrs. Katie Sturgis.
First off, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing this. This will only take 10 to 15 minutes or so. First off, why don't you just tell me a little about yourself and your background?
I am a teacher at McKinney Boyd High School. I have taught AP Environmental Science. This is either my 16th year of teaching this. Surprisingly, my background is actually in biology and chemistry, and I kind of lucked into this position, and I'm pretty self-taught on a lot of things, but it's become kind of my baby here that I teach at Boyd.
So let's jump right in. This is the Climate Change podcast. The first thing I want to talk about is just some data, some validity. At least 18 American scientific associations, along with international academies, U.S. government agencies, and over 200 worldwide scientific organizations have stated that climate change is real and caused by human action. Since they started doing systematic scientific assessments in the 1970s, the influence of human activity on the warming of the climate system has evolved from theory to established fact. Could you just tell me a little bit of your knowledge about what specific ways the climate is different now than it was in the past?
Our seasons are shifting, where we might start our springs earlier or summers later. We're seeing average, because you have climate change and you have global warming. And so we're seeing the average temperatures globally a degree higher than they have been historically. We're seeing the hottest summers on record. We're seeing more drought in places we shouldn't have droughts. We're seeing flooding in places we shouldn't have flooding. We're seeing glaciers melting at significant rates and disappearing in some regards, and which is causing sea levels to rise. And even though it's small numbers, when you say it's increasing by half a degree, that's a big deal in nature. To us, I always tell my students, it's not a big deal. Like if it gets hot, we can turn on our air conditioner. If, sea levels rising by a few centimeters isn't a big deal, but to the environment, it can be detrimental.
Right. Okay, let's jump over to kind of the politics and some of the political leanings. Mm-hmm. Democrats and Republicans have grown further apart over the last decade in their assessments of the threat posed by climate change. The Texas Tribune wrote that state legislators largely ignored pleas for critical reform from environmental advocates during this year's legislative session. Could you just share a little bit how you think politicians directly affect government laws and agendas for the environment?
This is a hard question because it's tough because you
just their effect on.
So what's happening right now is we have either you agree with the climate science or you disagree with the climate science. And I tell my students it's not I believe or don't believe, because it's not the tooth fairy or Santa Claus. It's either you agree with the science or you disagree with the science, and you should disagree with more science. And I always tell my kids it's okay to disagree with climate change as long as you're backing it up with other relevant science. But anyway, back to the political aspect of it. I feel like politicians are so far down the rabbit hole of, climate change is a hoax. I don't want to, spend money on something that isn't real. And it's just snowballed into this thing where, unfortunately, some politicians can't explain the science behind climate change, or the fact that climate change is happening, but the disagreement is, are humans causing it? But on the political side, it's climate change isn't happening. It's so, I don't know, like everything right now. It's just so to the left and to the right. And so I think politicians, it's easier to jump on that bandwagon and say climate change is not real. Here's why, we shouldn't be backing all of these things. And it just escalates without science, I think, is what it boils down to. And then they're making policies or they're vetoing policies. And I'm sure there are some things that are not valid, that are not going to help climate change policies, or they're too expensive for what they do. Like, I understand that aspect of it, but I think we've just gone down this rabbit hole of misinformation that's being fueled by politicians that can't even explain that, the difference between an iceberg melting and a glacier melting and how that causes sea levels to rise. And if you can't explain the difference to me, how can I trust that you are going to create policies in the best interest of myself and in their constituents?
That was a fantastic answer. Oh my goodness.
Thanks.
And it's funny because our next topic that I wanted to jump to was the education.
Uh-huh.
So some of the policies and curriculum and stuff. And Texas is one of only 6 states that does not use the next generation science standards to guide its K-12 science curriculum. The standards emphasize that climate change can be mitigated with actions that reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. A 2020 analysis of science curriculums in all 50 states by the National Center for Science Education and the Texas Freedom Network Education Fund gave Texas an F grade for how well schools in the state taught the scientific consensus on climate change. As a firsthand college-level science educator, how do you think that Texas is teaching climate change compared to other topics? Because I know we have great science here. It's just, this is pretty a narrow look into it.
So I've taught biology and advanced biology as well as AP Environmental Science. AP Environmental Science, I am geared by College Board and their standards, so I do, and I mean, I willingly, but I do have to teach it in depth. So when you have like AP College Board is going to have its own national standards, but if I were to compare it to advanced biology and the TEKS, the only place we can really teach climate change is in biology, and unfortunately because our scope in sequence is so large and we have a state test that we have to take at the end of April, beginning of May, we've had to cut it out. Or it's just like, hey, here's a blurb about climate change, and if you're interested, take AP Environmental Science when you're a junior or a senior. And so I feel like the only way students are going to learn about climate change or environmental science, just anything in regards to that, they're going to have to want to. So they would want to take AP Environmental Science to learn more about it, because their core classes do not have the opportunity to teach it, and they just redid the TEKS in biology. I don't even know if climate change is even a snippet in that anymore. And if it is, it's something that we don't get to focus on because we have to teach them so many other things in biology. And so that's where we're lacking, is if you want to learn about climate change, you have to seek it out.
It is a humongous subject, that is for sure, but thank you. So those are a little bit of the broader stuff. The last few things I want to talk about are a little more narrower. The energy companies, they have a humongous role. Oil industries have given hundreds of millions of dollars to senators and American representatives, part of the GOP party. It seems at times as if Texans are being hindered from fully being informed about climate change because of strong connections between the fossil fuel corporations and important figures. What do you think reliance on money's role is in helping prevent environmental change and also hurting the planet?
I always say nobody owns the sun. And so, like, the problem is, and I mean, in Texas, we do have nuclear power, we have wind power, we don't have geothermal, we don't really have hydroelectric, but we do have some renewable energy. And the thing is if we use the sun with passive solar heating or wind and all these other things, you can't pay anybody for that. And I think that's the biggest problem with energy. There's just like so many different things. And so, but because they're not allowing us to have that much control over where we're getting our energy from. And so, we can't phase out certain things until we have something in place. And so it's almost as if we're not trying to come up with new ideas, because that would give the common folk more access to cheaper available energy sources, and that doesn't put the money in pockets of people. And so I think, I don't know if that answered your question or not.
That was great.
I got sidetracked.
No, that was great.
But I think, if we could utilize solar power a little bit more and wind power a little bit more, because we have access to it in Texas. But nobody owns the sun. And so imagine if you or I could go out, and this is such a fantastical thing, but I'm such a proponent of just algae for biofuels. I mean, imagine you or I going out in your backyard and having somewhere where you can grow algae and have a system to turn that into fuel for your car. That would be free for you and I, minus the setup and, all the mechanics and all that. But it's just something that until nobody's going to push anything that can't be owned by somebody, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I kind of meant to say this is my question, but even since I've been around, I'm seeing more and more renewable energy, like you're saying, electric cars, organic materials, recycling, all that good stuff. So that's a step in the right direction. Their natural disasters are occurring more frequently, and the average cost of them and death toll is also up from each one. Are the gradual increases in major weather catastrophes something that humans can truly help prevent, such as storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods?
To some degree. I mean, you have natural things like El Nino and La Nina that are going to cause more natural occurrences of wildfires and landslides and certain stuff like that. But humans, when we talk about sea levels rising or hurricanes and flooding in coastal areas, one thing humans can do is to leave those wetlands and mangroves and those forested areas, especially near coastlines, alone, because those prevent erosion on the coast.
Right.
And so they help prevent a lot of that damage that occurs. And so just not developing on coastlines and leaving, like I said, wetlands and mangroves and estuaries and all of those things intact, it's going to help with erosion control from hurricanes, runoff control. It's going to harbor a high biodiversity, which will help the area. As far as, there's just some things we can't control in general, as far as, the big picture of you have to reduce greenhouse gases. You have to do these big things. But if you're able to preserve your coastlines with natural areas, it can help prevent or mitigate some of that damage that's going to occur one way or another.
That was fantastic. I really appreciate you helping me out with this.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about misinformation of climate change or Texas legislation with climate change?
It's hard. The classes I teach, like I said, my kids sign up for it, so I'm typically preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
I wish there were more opportunities to have that open discussion with teachers that are open. Like I said, I tell my kids it's okay to disagree with this, but you have to understand what you're disagreeing with. And I think it would I would love to have more of that in our curriculum at the core level, just so they can be exposed to what the science is, so they can make their own informed decisions. But yeah, I don't have any questions necessarily about any of it.
Well, thank you again.
Of course.
Awesome.